Today I'm going to do part 2 of the Seiko tuna can design history video. Part 1 dealt with the automatic tunas, like this, and today we'll talk about the quartz tunas. To simplify things, I'll just break them down into two categories. One, we have the fancier quartz tuna cans that were made from one-piece cases, like the automatics, where there's no screw back on the back. And then we have the simpler ones that are made of two-piece cases. Let's start with the history behind this one. Originally, it was released in 1978, even though its official name is the PYF 018. Realistically, people just refer to it as the 600-meter golden tuna. This was thinner than the automatic, but basically similar except for the golden highlights. It used a quartz movement, which was a 7549, which was the precursor, I believe, to the 7C43. Now, in this case, you had the titanium shroud, much like in the first automatic release. Now, in 1986, there was a big leap. This moved up to 1,000-meter water resistance. Aesthetically, it's still the same, but the shroud is now made out of ceramic. Now, it's pretty interesting because a few years ago, there was a big hubbub in the watch world where companies were starting to manufacture ceramic cases, and there were a few catastrophic failures documented on the internet, and everyone was up at arms about the reliability of ceramic, whereas Seiko's been manufacturing ceramic shrouds for professional dive watches since '86 with very few, to my knowledge, reported failures. And I think that's pretty interesting, though. If it does fail, it's pretty expensive. I think probably $400 or $500 at least to replace it. So there's that. For what it's worth, I've dropped mine countless times, and as you can see, it picks up marks, but knock on wood, it's been pretty good for me. Though I have to say, every time I do drop it by accident, my heart does stop as I wonder if this will be the time. But again, it hasn't been so far. Now, again, so the upgrade in '86 was the ceramic shroud, which they've continued to use, and the movement's been upgraded to a 7C43. But overall, it's basically the same watch. And this has been made for quite a while. I was never a fan of the golden highlights personally, and I guess Seiko ultimately came to the same conclusion because this was replaced by the Darth Tuna, originally as an SBBN 011 in 2005, and then an slightly upgraded cosmetically SBBN 013 in 2009. Now this is a Robert Marks version, which is sort of like a little hybrid. But basically those watches are the same without the Robert Marks markings on the front and back. Again, one-piece case, ceramic shroud, no more golden highlights, traditional hands without the bisection, same 7C43 movement. So basically these two really are the same watches, they just have a different aesthetic. Now, from a functional perspective, these watches are a lot easier to wear than an automatic tuna can because they're thinner in profile, they're lighter weight, and it's just easier to wear on a daily basis because it's just not the boat anchor that the automatics are. Now, there's the disadvantage is that it's a one-piece case, and even though it's a long-life battery, you still have to replace them every 5 or so years, and I certainly don't feel comfortable removing everything this way, so I'd have to send it in. So that's the price you pay for having the one-piece case in a quartz setting. But basically, since '78, the main changes were aesthetics and shroud material. Basically, obviously there have been crystal upgrades and things like that, but from a more functional design perspective, those are the main changes. Now we have the two-piece cases. Now again, I just want to throw in, obviously I don't have every watch, so I'm just using examples from every line that I do have as demonstration models. The first two-piece case, quartz two-piece case, in that this case back can just be easily removed to switch out the battery, was also released in 1978, and it looked very similar to this. And basically it was a cheaper material tuna can with lower depth rating, using a steel bezel and steel shroud, and this is an example of what happens when the shroud takes damage. Much more convenient Phillips screws than the annoying hex screws, and a more traditional case. Advantage being much easier to service. Disadvantage being, theoretically, it's one more point for water entry if there's some sort of disaster. The dial is very similar, So that's really stayed the same. Same day date. Movements, same, 7C43. I mean, the original 78 version of this had the same 7549, and later it was upgraded. And around 2001, this actual model was released by Seiko, the SBBN 007. It looked very similar to the original one, though this is a little bit confusing. The original one had a black bezel insert, whereas the original SBBN 007 had a silver bezel insert. I don't like the silver, as I think it's too low contrast, so I removed it and put a black bezel insert in from an SKX 007. Eventually, I guess Seiko also saw the light, and they started releasing upgraded versions of this with a black bezel insert too, which is much more expensive. This, incidentally, SBBN 007, which was released in 01, retailed for about 50,000 yen. And the interesting thing was you could buy a tuna can. It was unheard of at the time, for about 300 US when this was new. And that was really amazing. And this was the gateway for a lot of people at the time, because the golden tunas were a lot more expensive, not to mention the automatics. And this is basically it. It's just a low frills, less exotic tuna. And again, this has been released since the SBBN 007 has been canceled, but for a lot more money. And eventually they got rid of the traditional Seiko tuna hands, which I'm really not a fan of, the loss of that. So that really is the end of the traditional tuna can design. And basically, if we put them out together, what we really have is sort of continuum of exotic build and material, where the cheapest is all stainless steel and it has a traditional, relatively simple two-piece case. Then we move up to the same quartz movement, but a fancier, one-piece, more exotic case with a ceramic shroud. And then the fanciest, most exotic, a thicker one-piece case with a fancier automatic movement and also a titanium shroud. So as you go up in price, it gets more exotic, the build gets more unique, and functionally they all work the same. And I'm not a saturation diver or professional diver, so this is just for wearing every day. And realistically, the further down the spectrum you go, the easier it is to wear. This is easier to wear, this is easier to service. You could service this at home, and it's just lighter weight and just easier day to day. I think this is probably a good balance in that you have a lot of the exoticness of the fancier tuna cans, but it's quartz, so it runs easily day to day. You don't have to worry so much about long-term servicing. And it's, even though it's a large watch relative to this, it's still relatively easy to wear every day because it's so dark, and it really has a nice stealthy look to it. And then, you have the boat anchor that is the automatic, which is a bit of a chore to wear. It takes a while to get used to, but you sort of do it anyway despite the huge size, because it's sort of cool and unique. And that really sums up the major tuna can families. Cheapest, two-piece quartz, more expensive one-piece quartz, and really expensive automatics. With those out of the way, I do want to mention one other watch, and that's this. Now, I don't have the precursor, the H558. This came after that, which is a lower spec H601. The H558 is better known as the Seiko Arnie because he wore it in a bunch of movies. But the really interesting thing, and a lot of people sort of don't think about it too much, is that the original was released in '82, and look what it has. It has the same kind of shroud. And as I said in the first video, one of the most iconic components of a tuna can is the shroud. Now sure, nowadays Seiko's been putting shrouds on everything because it's, I guess, caught on. But back then, if they put a shroud on a watch in the early 80s, it was because of function. And incidentally, aside from protection of the bezel, this is made of polyurethane, and the goal was impact protection. And the downside of it is, as this ages, this tends to crack. And obviously Seiko doesn't have any more parts for this, but thankfully people have 3D printed replacement shrouds that apparently work quite well, so the aftermarket is still okay for that. Now, obviously you can't call this a tuna can, but it does, I think, need at least a little asterisk for people to keep in mind that the shroud, the traditional tuna shroud, was used fairly early on into the tuna's lifestyle, so I really do think it deserves some mention. And aside from that, there are two other oddballs I just want to mention. There was a Quartz 5M series 200 meter tuna can, technically a tuna can, slightly different handset, and it's smaller. That was also that used I believe a polyurethane bezel. And then there was the later 600 meter tuna. Some people call it a ashtray or UFO because of the strange looking bezel. It doesn't have a shroud, and the handset is different, but it's basically a tuna can with a redesigned strange looking bezel and no shroud. And I think that, for the most part, up to the late 2000s, summarizes the major tuna design watches. And that's about it for this video. And as usual, thanks for watching.